And we're talking about forgiveness these days, and today's quite a topic, quite a subject, and I need to preface it so that you're prepared. I think it's fair to say that the most complex area of forgiveness involves the relationships we hold with our family, parents, children, siblings, grandparents, extended family. And this is such a layered and complex facet of the arena of forgiveness in our lives, and certainly as we lead up towards the great day of forgiveness, which is the resurrection of Jesus Christ, the new life in us that raises us out of our sin and leads us into forgiveness as a way of living. This is such a complex area that there is just no way that we could do it justice in 25 minutes. And we're not going to do a big group therapy session with crying rooms after the service either. So what I want to share with you today on the concept of forgiveness with our families is really some axioms I've learned over the first half of my life, or at least I hope the first half of my life, knowing that I have so much more to learn. And within this community, there are so many here who are so much farther down the road of wisdom and experience. It's an experience here in this church, walking with many families, many couples, many children, as they talk through the wounds that they've experienced in their own families. Sometimes we can look at the Bible with sentimentalism, thinking, oh, wouldn't it be great if we could just get back to the first families of the Bible when they got it right? And we gloss over the incredible dysfunction that existed in those first families of Genesis, which, by the way, accurate biblical reading says these are arenas where God condescended to the incredible mess that was the human experience, even in the first families of the Scriptures. And so, from the very beginning, even with Adam and Eve, and then to their children, we start seeing the pattern of scapegoating, shame, hiding, murder, jealousy, all within families. This must grieve the heart of God, that the one thing He created, this idea of family, is the source of so much pain and heartache. So, today, maybe you can take heart by the passage we're going to read, that whatever you've experienced or struggled with in your own family, it may be far better than what we see here in Genesis 25. And so open your Bible with me to that chapter, okay? And as I read, I want to see if you can recognize the dysfunction and put a little mental star next to the verse. Maybe we collectively could just murmur the word. I don't know if there's a word like this in Hebrew. Martha, Rob, maybe you can correct me. But the Hebrew word for yikes, or ugh, okay? Starting with chapter 25, verse 1, I'm going to break this up in sections so we don't get caught on some off-ramps. The Scriptures tell us this about this family. Abraham had taken another wife whose name was Keturah. Yikes. Then there's a long list of children, blended family, stepchildren. Verse 5 tells us, Abraham left everything he owned to Isaac, but while he was still living, he gave gifts to the sons of his concubines. Yikes. And sent them away from his son Isaac to the land of the east. Double yikes. Let's just send them away. And then jump to what happens in Isaac's family. Verse 19, this is the account of the family line of Abraham's son Isaac. Abraham became the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel the Aramean, from the Paddan Aram, and sister of Laban the Aramean. By the way, this is intercultural marriage now. May not be dysfunction, definitely complex, right? Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because, notice the words here, she was childless. Yikes. We all know that the language there could have been we were childless, should have been we were childless, but instead the blame is on her. She was childless. The Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. The babies jostled each other within her, and she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. The Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment, so they named him Esau. I just want to say for all redheads in the world, just underline that passage. It's very validating. Yep. After this, his brother came out with his hand grasping Esau's heel, and so he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to them. Hey, that's a deserving of a yikes, maybe even that's a miracle, right? The boys grew up, and Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was content to stay at home among the tents. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Yikes, yikes, and more yikes. What a mess. Once when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau came in from the open country, famished. He said to Jacob, his brother, "Quick, let me have some of that red stew. I'm famished." That is why he is also called Edom. Jacob replied, "First, sell me your birthright." Pause there for a second. I've heard of siblings squabbling over the last slice of pizza, but this must have been some amazing stew, right? Sell me your birthright for this meal. Esau says, "Look, I'm about to die. What good is the birthright to me?" But Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore an oath to him, selling his birthright to Jacob. And then Jacob gave Esau some bread and some lentil stew. He ate and drank, and then got up and left. So Esau despised his birthright. Yikes. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. A lot of things here. A lot of things. Birthright had everything to do with his line of continuing the family name and tradition, and of course all the possessions and whatnot. But really, at the end of the day, Esau despised the fact that at one point there was a vision given to his mother that said that he would be lesser, his younger brother would be greater. Now, aside from forgiveness issues that he would have had to work out with God, which is part of the journey that we all have in our lives, a lot of us can resonate with wanting to despise our birthright, despise the family we were born into, maybe the alcoholism or the abuse or whatever it may be. And in this short story, we see marriage affairs, concubines and mistresses, the painful difficulty with pregnancy, and then the blaming of one over the other about that difficulty. We see sibling rivalry, parental favoritism, conflict over the family estate, parents who love one child or over another. And then there's the whole Esau hair thing. I mean, was this the first recorded description of someone with inordinate back hair? It may be. But I think many of us could just agree, we could nod our heads, yeah, this is not healthy. This is not a functional, healthy family. And maybe we can take comfort in the fact that we aren't the only ones. Even those that were closest to creation, God's intent and best, we're getting it wrong. Seriously, though, with all of this, as I make some jokes, the dysfunction of the family dynamic is, I think, a universal experience for so many of us. And it makes us want to say, maybe on the 9th day of creation, God created therapists for a reason. Maybe we can take comfort in the fact that if God can do redemptive work through the family of Abraham, the great high father of our faith, I mean, before Moses, it's Abraham. And Abraham is considered to be one of the archetypal figures in all of human history around faithfulness to God. If God can do work in Abraham's family, maybe God could heal our stories too. And so today I want to just share some misconceptions of forgiveness that I've witnessed and experienced and have learned. Some I'm still learning. And we're going to talk about 4 misconceptions, and I want to reframe those to maybe some healthy things for the sake of our own families. They certainly could be true towards forgiveness in any arena of our lives, but especially with those closest to us in our immediate family. I think the largest misconception in this conversation is simply this: the misconception that the other person must do something in order for me to forgive. The other person must do something in order for me to forgive. One of the most difficult relationship breaks in my life was with my older brother, Doug. And he was dying. He had heart failure. He was in University of Pennsylvania hospital, and we were flown in to spend the last days with him. His body was full of fluid because his heart could no longer function in a way that helped his body process water. So he was in great pain. And I remember on that flight thinking about the things I wanted to say to him. He was the first man that introduced me at the very young age to awful and dark things. And he didn't do what an older brother should have done. And I carried in my heart a lot of bitterness. And so my imaginations were that there was going to be a confrontation in that time with him, and that he would finally own up to what he did. I got there and my heart melted. We were using balm on his feet because he was so swollen and suffering. And it made me realize that the pain he caused towards me was out of his own brokenness. And here he was lying in a hospital bed in his final days, and I knew something in him knew that he wanted to say words. He just couldn't say them. He couldn't do it. And yet, I learned in that moment, as well as many others, that my forgiveness of him and the grief that was required of that forgiveness didn't require him to do something. It was something that had to be done in me. And something about touching his body and helping relieve some of the pain on his final days was really cathartic. And the reframe to this misconception that the other person must do something in order for me to forgive is that only I can do the work of forgiveness. And as we began to talk about last week, the work of grief. Only I can do that work. Grief and forgiveness, as I said last week, sisters. You may be familiar with something that we deal with in pastoral ministry quite a bit, but of course in any circles of therapy, what's called the Kubler-Ross grief cycle. It's called the cycle of grief. You may be familiar with this. But take a look at this image. When someone does something to us in such a close way as what occurs with family, we experience pain. And the way that we process that pain is everything. Despite what another person does, only you can do this work of grief. And where we get stuck in forgiveness is honestly where we get stuck in grief. If you look at the first beginning portion of working through grief, are you stuck in forgiveness? Are you stuck in grief around the area of confusion or maybe being afraid? Let's talk about working through that part of forgiveness and grief, which is denial. A lot of us want to just push it off and go, you know what, I'll just let it go. That person's harm towards me. But denial doesn't do anything. All it does is stuff a wet sleeping bag into a sack. And guess what happens when that happens? It stinks, you stink, everything stinks. Because we haven't actually dealt with the mess, right? Or number two, are you holding on to bitterness? And if that's the case, then we need to talk about anger and the anger stage of grief. Are you ruminating or carrying sadness or anxiety? Let's talk about depression. This is, by the way, I think the thing in our culture that nobody wants to talk about, but everybody's experiencing, which is some form of depression, latent depression after COVID. The goal, of course, is to get to peace, is to get to acceptance. And I think what's so difficult about forgiveness is that we all have a lot of unresolved hurts in our hearts, and so it's complex. Often a therapist can help us work through those complex emotions, and that's why grief is so hard, is that we need help. We need community. We need others. And this is what I mean by the statement, only you can do the work, only we can do the work, is that usually in a conflict, it's not just the pain that is present, it's the pain of things unresolved from the past where our trauma experienced in our lives and embedded itself into our minds, and that's where it's stored. It's called, by the way, the amygdala. And the amygdala fires. It kicks into gear when we're offended or hurt, and it makes us defensive. That's where we get the phrase fight or flight. So much so that memories in our heads, the unhealed and unresolved hurts, are now making their way into the present. And now the two get combined, the moment at hand and also the moments in the past that have never been resolved. And it can be an explosion. Think of why there is the characteristic Thanksgiving family squabble, right? Because you get everybody in a room, unresolved hurts, unresolved grievances, and all of a sudden someone brings up politics. And then there's the family fight. But you all know that we're not talking about the thing, we're talking about the thing behind the what? Behind the thing. And sometimes we're talking about the thing behind the thing behind the thing. And that's where it gets really complex, because the thing behind the thing behind the thing was something I never got a chance to talk about with mom or with my sibling, right? And so what makes forgiveness of the offense so difficult is not just what we're living in the present, it's the story we're telling ourselves from the past. All the stuff from the past, the unresolved hurts, and they form scripts in our mind for the present. This is why, friends, some of the most powerful words can be the decision to form a new script, which begins with beautiful words like, I think it's time I forgive my mother. I think it's time I forgive my father. I think it's time I forgive my brother, my sister. Because I'll tell you this, and take this one to the bank. No matter how many conversations where we agree to disagree on the details of the event or what exact words are assigning a tent or whatever it may be, the real issue is the deeper pain. Sometimes from something other than the moment we want to forgive. And what we're really talking about is the pain. And if we can get down to the pain and have empathy for each other in the pain, then we're doing the work of forgiveness. And if you're waiting for the other person in your family to make the first move or to make the only move, you'll be stuck in grief and you will feel powerless because you just can't control the other person. You can only control yourself. The grief is yours to process. Okay? I know that's a hard word. It's a really difficult word, but it's an essential word. The work is yours. It cannot be someone else's. Otherwise, you're in bondage to their process and their work. Okay? Sound good? Boy, I know I'm meddling. Misconception number 2. If I forgive, I'm saying what the other person did was okay. Let me reframe that into something I think that's more healthy and helpful. Forgiveness is processing pain, not forgetting pain. And it's certainly not excusing pain. When I counsel people who've been deeply hurt by another person, I say, you don't have to start with forgiveness. This is, by the way, the problem Todd Deathridge mentioned at the very beginning of this series. Probably the most important thing he said, which is that he was attuned to the concept of cheap forgiveness, which far too many Christians, for whatever reason, feel like is a legitimate response to deep pain. It's not. Forgiveness is not something that you pop in a microwave and pull out 30 seconds later. It's a slow cooker. It takes time, just like grief takes time. It takes time to process through that. And instead, I say, people, don't talk about forgiveness, right? Let's talk about your pain. Let's acknowledge the pain that you've experienced. Because if we don't do that, then it feels like forgiveness is saying your pain doesn't matter. Or what happened didn't affect you. It did matter, and it did affect you. So even if you're like right now and you're crossing your arms saying, you don't know what I experienced, and you don't know how bad I was hurt, right? You're right. You're right. I don't know. No one does. Only you know it, and only Jesus can know it. Only Jesus could know your experience alongside you. But here's the real challenging part of forgiveness, and take this one to the bank. This is the second time I'm telling you to go to the bank. Bankers are loving this sermon, right? It's the real challenging part of forgiveness. Take this to the bank. Pain may not be your choice, but allowing the pain to continue may be. Bitterness is a plant that only grows when it's watered. And you control whether you will water that plant or not. And it can be a weed, it can be a bush, or it can be a tree. And I can tell you that the problem for so many of us, myself included, is when it becomes a tree, that's my problem, not the person who originally caused the harm. I have to take care of, and I have to control how I decide to manage my pain. Some of us, myself included, make a monument out of our pain and our experience with loved ones. And we like to go back to that monument almost like a gravestone and attend to it and make sure the flowers are still growing around it so that no one ever forgets how I was hurt. You get to control and decide if you will water the plant of bitterness and keep that pain continuing. That's misconception 2. If I forgive, I'm saying the other person did okay. Fact is, forgiveness is a processing of pain, not forgetting it, not excusing it, but it's the work that you must do in processing it. Misconception number 3. This is oh so hard. I know exactly what happened. I know exactly what happened. The reframe here is something that I'll borrow from our wise and generous and gracious executive pastor, Mike Bates, here at EPPC. And it's a phrase he said so many times in front of me, it'll be ingrained in my heart and head. And it's simply this: we don't see things as they are, we see them from where we are. We don't see things as they are, we see them from where we are. I think this is what is so difficult about broken relationships, especially with 2 or more people, with multiple perspectives and multiple histories, multiple woundings, multiple interpretations. Did you know that when your amygdala gets activated in pain or in a threat or in a difficult, high anxiety situation like conflicts in our family do, did you know that when it gets activated, it's very difficult for you to observe accurately? You actually have very limited observation skills in that moment. Okay? They see this in social sciences concerning witnesses to traumatic events. And by the way, Pastor Martha is going to talk about forgiveness in marriage next week. And the following week, Pastor Mike is going to be talking about forgiveness of ourselves, which is 2 other dynamics in this conversation. But this is so true that you'll find this in marriage counseling experiences where they talk about this phenomenon. And that is that when you are a witness or you experience something traumatic or difficult, especially visibly in your peripheral vision, that you will often misinterpret it. This happens in car accidents. One such incident occurred where a truck ran a red light and caused a violent collision that resulted in the loss of life. All the witnesses described the events from their unique perspective. Only problem when it reached trial was that every single one of the witnesses got the color of the truck wrong. Isn't that interesting? All of them were there. All of them saw what happened from their distinct vantage point. Not a single one of them could get the color of the truck right. Because there's something about our limited perspective. You don't see things as they are. You see them from where you are. So when we get into the work of forgiveness, the hardest part is that you may not see all the contextual factors. And that's the difficult work of a humble posture, one that says, I don't know exactly what happened. I know the impact it had on me, but I don't know exactly what happened. It takes humility to say, I may be interpreting this situation from only my vantage point. Childhood wounds are very important to process with a therapist because this is very common when it comes to childhood wounds. I remember talking to a woman who, when she was a little girl, experienced something awful. It's that her parents took them to a cabin in the middle of the state of Washington near Leavenworth, but they got lost and didn't arrive until way late. The cabin was a little bit of walking distance from where they parked the car, and so the parents grabbed the children, who they thought were asleep, carried them to the cabin, put them in the beds, and then went back to the car to unload. Well, it took quite a bit of time to do the unloading, and in that meantime, she woke up and was in the middle of a cabin in the middle of nowhere. She felt abandoned, and she had a terrible fear of bears. Now, a 9-year-old child has a limited perspective on this, but what it created in her was a pattern of feeling like she was abandoned, and she had panic attacks throughout her adolescence. And the work for her that was so difficult was for her to not only forgive her parents, but to forgive herself, because the 9-year-old self couldn't interpret things accurately. And so she lived a bulk of her life with an inordinate fear of the outdoors and being abandoned. This is how the human mind works. You know, your parents, most likely, I can't say this for everyone, your parents aren't as bad as you thought they were. Right? In fact, you're probably more of a screwed up parent to your children than your parents were to you. But your pain and your memories from your childhood are valid. That's the impact it had towards you. But they're also limited because they're the memories of a child. And a child can't see everything accurately or fully. Okay? You see, some moments in our lives and stories get burned into our brains. I think this is kind of what was happening with Esau. Like at some point in his childhood, someone told him, no matter how much you are the firstborn and your birthright will come to you, Jacob's going to take it from you. And God said so, right? And something got burned into his brain, and it shifted the way he saw himself and others and the way he saw the world. And in turn, friends, for us, it changes the way we think about others, especially members of our family. And those little perspective shifts can then become beliefs, and those beliefs not only become a belief about ourselves, about our parents, about our children, it also becomes a way of operating where we carry ourselves with those beliefs. And the pain, unprocessed, becomes a pattern that we can project on to others. That, friends, is the tragic story of Isaac's family. And if you read from Genesis 25 on, you'll see how that pain was passed on from one generation to another. And that there had to be healing over the generations. Lisa TerKeurst is a recent writer on the concept of forgiveness, especially within family. And she wrote an excellent book, I can't suggest it more highly for all of you, entitled Forgiving What You Can't Forget. And she has 3 chapters, 3 movements that are so beautiful that can really help all of us deal with some of the unresolved hurts from your past. One of the chapters is called Collecting the Dots. It's the looking over your past, your history, or your experiences with your family. And then the next chapter is Connecting the Dots. And the third one is Correcting the Dots. Now leave that up there for a moment if you can, guys. The problem for most of us is that we stop at the first movement. We collect the dots, all the grievances, all the things that have been done, all the ways we've been hurt by such and such, the person in our family, or maybe it's a couple of people. We collect those dots and we memorialize them. We don't necessarily do the work of connecting those dots to other moments of pain in our life that have exacerbated the original hurt. And then the thing that we often rarely do is correct the dots, is to let Jesus heal those things in us so that we can do the work of forgiveness in our own lives. And when we connect the dots, we see the pattern, and God helps us heal that pattern in correcting the view of ourselves, our parents, and others. And so the question we must ask all ourselves is, what's on the other side of this? What's on the other side of me? Okay. I had this experience with my dad. One of the wise things, and if your parents are still alive, I'd strongly encourage you, take your parents out for breakfast and just ask them questions about their childhood and their background. But there was one person in our family, my Aunt Lorene, who lived in Anaheim, California, and she just loved me and my brother, and there were some things that she did for us, and it was beautiful. And we asked her, why did she love my twin brother Ross and myself? Why did she love us so much? And he told us the story of her childhood, and then it involved my own dad's childhood, where his mom was killed when he was 5 years old, was hit by a drunk driver. And you know what's amazing when you connect the dots? Is you start correcting the dots. There were a lot of things about my dad that I held frustration or bitterness towards. Like one of them was his weight issues. But hearing his childhood story and what he dealt with and what his Aunt Lorene had dealt with back during the war, World War II, oh my gosh. It helped me heal the dots. It helped me see him in a new light. He was a miraculous man. He never should have arrived at a life that was capable of love and generosity and forgiveness. Not with the cards he was dealt. But he did the work. He healed the dots. And it made me realize that misconception 3 really is important to know. I don't know exactly what happened in my dad's life. I don't see them as they are. I see them from where I am, which is just a young kid. Right? Okay. That's number 3. Last one is misconception 4, and we'll end with this. I need to understand why before I can forgive. I need to understand why before I can forgive. You know, one day we'll be sitting around the campfire up in heaven, and Jacob and Esau will be sitting there. Esau's going to have red hair, 6'2", look just like me. No? Okay. They're going to tell their story. And I bet that part of Esau's thing was like, I don't know why God did what he did. I don't know why God gave that vision to Rebekah. I don't know any of it. But in the grand scheme of things, it really didn't matter once he got to heaven. And the reframe for us, each of us, if I could give you any gift, would be that freedom comes from the right questions, not the answers. The right questions, not the answers. Needing to understand why someone did something is a trap that can snare you in bitterness. Fact is, life is full of complexities and mysteries. You may never understand why someone did something, just like with my aunt and her blessing towards us. People who hurt others are often hurting within themselves and have terrible stories within themselves. They don't even understand it themselves. Sometimes people will hurt you in your family or in other places, and they couldn't even explain why. Don't let that prevent you from stepping into the shoes of another. Could it be that you really don't know the pain that they carry? We're all carrying hidden battles and scars from our past. And this is where I think Jesus is urging you and me to choose the path of healing by releasing those things to him and the need for answers. Jesus gives us courage, often through mentors and therapists, to ask better, more healing questions rather than ruminating and being fixated on having to need answers. Questions like this: why is this hurting me so badly? What's the pain behind the pain that makes me hurt so badly in this moment? Or how can this pain be transformed to something redemptive in my story? Or better yet, I love this question: what value in this conflict is being revealed? You realize that you don't have conflicts over stuff you don't care about? I've never heard a single member of this church get worked up about hockey games in Canada, because we don't care. Now, get me started on Seahawks 49ers, and we're going to rumble, okay? We don't care about things we don't value. I'm not a hockey guy. We don't care about the things that don't have meaning to us. We get in conflicts over things that mean something to us. And so any conflict, by the way, reframe here, any conflict reveals something you really care about. So what's the value underneath this argument or this pain and this fractured relationship? How can we get to that? Maybe it's that I value the ability to express my feelings and not be judged for them. That's why I'm worked up in this moment. And when you can get to that place, that's the secret sauce in reconciling relationships with our family members. Another question: what is making me hold on to bitterness and anger? What is it? Do I feel like nobody's seen me or recognized what I experienced? Is that why I'm holding on? Or how about, why did I allow this behavior to continue in cases where we were actually allowing someone to use us or hurt us or create a codependent cycle. Lastly, what in my response made the conflict worse? When's the last time you heard someone ask that question? That the conflict was one thing, but my response to the conflict was another thing that made it even worse. How many people have the maturity to say that in a family dynamic, right? Friends, we all have a story that we tell ourselves, and we've got to make sure, this is my word to you in closing in this really complex concept and conversation, is that we have got to make sure the story we tell ourselves lines up with not only the truth of what God may be speaking in and through us, but also the most healed version of who we are. Have you ever heard someone say, I'm just trying to be true to myself? Right? Anybody heard that? And I'm like, yeah, I get that. But we have to make sure that we're being true to the most healed, healthy, whole, and holy version of ourselves. Because if I'm true to my most unhealed self, it can really take me to some bad places. But if I'm true to the healed, whole self in Jesus Christ, my family heals, the world is better, and everyone wins. Because we can start experiencing heaven on earth now, as Jesus intended when he says, forgive as you have been forgiven. Lord, may it be true in our hearts and our minds. This brings up a lot of things in us. And I pray for just your Holy Spirit to do the work of not only collecting the dots, but connecting the dots. And then, if it's your will and your way, and you can help us correcting the dots for healing and wholeness, we pray. And all God's people said.